This is going to be my first look at the Vive l'Empereur series by Didier Roy. This is the most recent, I think, from Legion, in conjunction with Pratzen Editions. Pratzen put out their big Waterloo one, and that was part of the convincing for this. I got a special deal if you bought this and Waterloo this fall. And, you know, I said, I've seen this system. I know enough about it that I think it's kind of cool. I don't know if it's going to be enough, but we'll see. This particular one is somewhat smaller, and it's the most modern rules, so I wanted to go with this. So I picked this up, but I did pick this up along with the Waterloo quad. Little Return of the Emperor or something. Yeah, let's butcher French and English together. Waterloo has been my big goal, and I've bought a couple of games on Waterloo. I've got the Berg 4 battles. I've got Wellington's victory over there. I do not have many games from the Labatt series, and haven't played any of those. I haven't played either of these, although I have played something on the Wellington's victory level. As to this system itself, I've got a couple. I've got Friedland and Eckmel as well from the old Azure Wish ones. I've read the rules to Friedland, which convinced me, yeah, I want to pick more of these up. And then picking this one up was the rules felt pretty sketchy to Friedland, and I wanted to... Friedland. And I wanted to see if the rules had improved. Well, they still feel very, very loose and sketchy. In some ways, this feels, with a lot of options in it, it feels almost like a war game kit in some ways, more than a single system, because you have a lot of different choices, especially where the command rules come into play. There's like 5 different versions of command. But anyway, let's take a look at what the rules are like. I'm going to be doing a really tiny scenario to begin with. This is part of Ocaña. And I'm going to be doing the cavalry engagement that happened before the battle. I'll continue with other scenarios in this box, and then probably be playing other games of the series as I go. I've been really neglecting Napoleonics. Let's see what we got here. First of all, let's look at the game. The map does not impress me. This looks like a Rick Barber map that's like been kind of done in too lazy a fashion. It's got a lot of his style in terms of this. I don't know if they have... I really doubt that this is his, because it does look so sparse. I don't know if we have credits anywhere here. I don't want to look on the back. But it's done in his style, but the graphics, these browns, it looks so... I don't know. I've seen some of his games where he's got color where they do look this way, so maybe. Here's our sequence of play. You open up with cav charges, which are going to be kind of a pulsed activity, if I recall correctly. I haven't read the rules in a few weeks. Then movement. Then the non-moving player gets a defensive fire. The attacker, or the moving player, gets an offensive fire, a melee phase, and a rally. Hey, that sounds a lot like TSS, except for the cav charges, right? Our counters. Okay. Our counters are very hard to read for me. In particular, I was looking at these values here, which resulted in me having to wear reading glasses over my glasses. That's a bad sign. But, if you have normal eyesight, it's probably fine. Mine are just going bad. What are the values on here? So this number's the main... Oh, let's look at a regular unit. So we've got the formation up here on the top. And so this is like a line infantry. This is going to be a cav unit in line formation. And then here we've got it in a column formation. We have a number of different formations here. with pictures as they go. The long counters don't really mean much because we're only putting a counter in each hex. A counter only takes up one hex, so it loses some of the advantages that I see to long counters, but does still present graphically a nice position. We have a fire value here, which of course the cav isn't going to have. A melee value, the number of steps that it has. We'll see how those work. Those are going to be charted on here, although you can use these markers as casualty markers. These are sort of demoralization markers by the base rules, but there's an option to use them kind of like number counters in other games. A base morale, movement allowance, and the range for fire. Now, most units have a range of 1, but this is light infantry, so it has a heavier range fire. Artillery is going to also have ranged fire. 5 to 7 hexes. How about that? Okay. Let's look over here. Okay, so we've got our different formations. Whole bunch here. Kind of like a minis game. It really goes into a lot of different formation types. This feels kind of like the lighter minis games in a lot of ways. You get your line and column, you'll have your square. You have general order, which is sort of not really disorganized. It's a loose order that needs to be used in certain terrains. Disorganized, which is of course worse. And then you have the possibility of skirmishers. We have multiple different types of... that's another place where the rules kind of give you a few different options of how to handle it. Artillery, limbered, unlimbered, and disorg. And cav, column and line. You have to go in line for a charge, no other time. And then general order when it's in rough terrain, which can really screw up charges, if I recall. Okay. So infantry have 2 front hexes, 2 flank hexes, 2 rear hexes. When they're in line formation, they have a lower movement allowance. They're allowed to stack with artillery as long as they share at least 2 common front hexes. Okay, that's kind of interesting because you have to be aligned the same way. We'll see how that works, because some of the infantry aren't going to be sitting in 1 hex under some rule sets. Some of the infantry do take up 2 hexes, but it's only the ones with the skirmishers. Fire range is 1 hex if you're in normal line formation, which faces a vertex. Okay. If you're attacked from flank or rear, you're going to have half your melee value. Infantry in column. Yeah, let's get an infantry in it. Crap, I don't have one there. And this is cav versus cav fight. Well, column is represented for both infantry and cav with the reverse side, and you face a hex side here instead of a vertex, and you have 3 front hexes, but only 1 you can melee and or fire through if you have infantry, 2 flank and a rear. You can only move through the hex you're facing. Changing facing has a movement point cost, except for the first change before or after you cross a hex side. I've seen this before. I think Labatt has it. It's a very minis type rule, limiting your turn, giving you free turns. Other games have it too. The NBS does not, because it's at kind of a higher level. But at this lower level of game, it makes sense to restrict formation a little bit. Actually, not Labatt. I'm sure Labatt does, but Battles of the Age of Reason has this kind of, you have to pay for each facing change you make. Okay, when you're in column for infantry, you get a bonus for attacking. This is the, assault column or whatever. I'm a little iffy about giving that to anything in column. unless they have like a road column formation, or never have a unit in that formation for large movements. And I can't imagine the 4-map or 4-game Waterloo game not having marches of sufficient length. But we'll see how that handles it. Maybe it has special rules for road movement. If it's attacked from flank or rear, it's halved, same as in line. General order. Okay, general order is going to appear like your column formation, but you're in certain terrain: town, castle, brush, or woods. And we've got, our terrain definitions here, a bunch of charts here with all the different formations, morale modifiers, different combat tables, and then the terrain effects chart. Never thrilled with this. Terrain effects is listed on a per battle basis in some cases. When this is happening, I really prefer to see a terrain effects chart on the map as well. But the map kind of is completely used up by terrain. I'm not sure if it all needs to be. If there would have been room to put a little effects chart on there, but whatever. Yeah, and where do we have this? It's not very much. It's like stream except Zadora. I guess this is the stream here. It isn't completely, and here, for example, slopes, it's got one map where it doesn't have that, etc. It's going to be hard to find those, especially since there's a lot of information on the terrain effects chart, different movement costs for different units. It's not presented as nicely as the old SPI games used to present it. It could have just been organized differently on the same size sheet of paper, easily, or smaller. Okay. So yeah, general order is the only formation you can be in these terrain types. All 6 adjacent hexes are front hexes, but you only have 1 firepower when you're in this formation, which may be the firepower on column as well. I'm not sure. It shows it that in the picture. Okay, if you're in town or castle, any morale checks can be ignored. Any combat morale checks. Trouble with this. Okay, infantry doesn't take general order if it's disorganized. And you can stack with limbered artillery in a town or forest. I don't know what the stacking is. We've got this for every single formation, its own specific rules. And I don't know if I want to go through all of these. It's not the easiest way to present things, I don't think, but whatever. Can stack with artillery, limbered or unlimbered, as long as they have at least 2 common front hexes. Yeah. Okay. All right. So here we get to one of the weird ones, though. So I mean, square can't initiate melee. Its firepower is modified by -2 from the line firepower, and it's actually going to be represented with these little things connected to the rear of the counter. It all goes in the same hex. And it gives you sort of a visual appearance of a square as well as being the marker there. So that's kind of a cute design thing. It's got a bonus morale against cav. It can have artillery in mixed order. I don't remember what that is. Any other infantry or artillery cannot move through the square while it's in a different formation. No, they can, but they can't stop there to join the except if they join the square. As opposed to other games, cav can't enter an enemy infantry square. Okay. Now, this is how disorganized units are going to be represented. And maybe this changes, but you put one of these number markers across it. And that number marker is going to indicate, I think, the turn that you were disorganized. Yeah. And then All 6 hexes are considered front hexes. Once it's disorganized, it immediately retreats 2 hexes. It can't attack or melee. It uses column movement, but it can only move towards its lines of communication, i.e. it's basically retreating. They don't have to move, however. Firepower and melee are 1. It uses its column morale with a -2 modifier. And if it takes a second disorganization, it's eliminated from the game. And it can't stack with a good order unit. Okay. Now, what I'm not getting into there is the rally. The rally is going to be based on this number. A certain number of turns, I think it's like 2 turns after that, you can start rolling for rallies on the unit. So it's kind of knocked out for a couple of turns. You're not going to have the really rubber routes that like the Berg games seem to have. And a number of others, to tell you the truth. The Essek games also have that. I'm used to it. I see it as sort of a partial disorganization or whatever. Not that the unit's flying back and flying forward, but you know, this tries to handle that in a specific way. Tirailleurs. Okay, so now he talks about this with a note, and we're going to go into another note later, which allows you to break these units down completely, and that handles them completely different. But you can position your light infantry between 2 hexes in the basic game. And this gives them a fire range of 2. It can only be in clear farm or difficult terrain, i.e. where you're not in open order. And sometimes in marshes. You're in line formation. When a unit enters or leaves the tirailleur formation, the counter is moved half a hex. This doesn't cost you any movement. It's just a formation change to slide into the other hex. No opportunity or countercharge can take place, except if the unit makes several formation changes in order to make a lateral move, i.e. pretend this is one of them. If I'm sitting here like this, and I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this, yeah, I get to get shot at. It doesn't really explain how I get to get shot at for that, and at what point I've made the lateral move. My guess would be, if I'm like this and I drop into this, I'm fine. If I'm like this and I move to here and then I move to here, I've made a lateral move, right? So basically, if I do 2 formation changes to shift, I've done movement and then I get fired at. They have 3 front hexes, 3 rear hexes, and a pair of flanks. At 2 hex range, the firepower is modified by -2. Now this represents a cloud of skirmishers coming out from the unit. We're going to see that this is handled in a different way, which we'll probably be playing with, but I want to give you the base there. It can't do opportunity fire all the way out at 2 hexes, though, only at 1 hex, although it can do defensive fire. So light infantry are marked with a range of 2 on their counter, but they only have that if they're in this special formation. Nothing too exciting. They get a bonus to their defense, -1 to the dice, and their lights. And otherwise, they're in normal formation. What about the cav? This is the en bataille formation. This is done when you're in a charge or counter charge. You do this formation change for free as you're charging or counter charging. And this uses the formation after the counter charge morale check is resolved or at the beginning of the charge phase. You're not allowed to use the line formation for normal movement. Might want to. And you drop back into column as soon as you finish your charge. In some cases, terrain is forbidden, crossing rivers, charging into a castle, gully, or marsh. The melee value is dropped to 1 when you're attacking a square or in yucky terrain, or if you attack out of those terrains, in which case you're no longer in this formation, you're in the open order formation. The melee value is halved when you're countercharged from a rear or flank hex. Cav and column, this is your normal position when you're moving. And change facing, same rules. just all repeated. And, you know, I mean, there's not a lot of rule book here, and it's very repetitive in places. And big print and everything that I can read. General order, mandatory in certain terrains. No, yeah, this lasts as long as you're in that terrain. The exception is if you're disorganized or if you charge or countercharge, use line formation with the duration of the charge with a melee value of 1. So you do actually convert into the line formation. Cav disordered, same way of showing it as disordered infantry. And same basic rules there. Cav can voluntarily become disorganized, and this costs you no movement points. The reason you'd want to do this is to retreat. And we'll see that there's other ways that Cav can retreat, I think, in more of the optional rules. For artillery, you of course have limbered and unlimbered. If you're in a town, you must be limbered. You're not allowed to move through certain terrain except on the road. Facing changes, same as normal. Faces as column infantry, no fire. It's got a melee value for defense, and no morale check due to fire or melee while it's in a town. Unlimbered artillery, allowed in certain terrains. Facing similar to infantry. Movement is 0, of course, unless the unit is going to change formation. This has a cost of 2 movement points. But it can pivot, and the range is dependent on the fire value. The fire value decreases with the distance to the target. You subtract the number of hexes between the firing artillery and the target. Final minimum of 1 as long as you're up to the maximum, as long as you're within maximum range. Okay, what's going on here? Exception: 2 batteries each with one loss each combine their fire at long range. Why is this an exception and not an example? It looks like an example, I guess. According to this rule, they have a final value of 1 plus 1 equal 2. In this case, the final value is 1 because you don't want the 2 half batteries to be better than a full battery. So basically, yeah, you calculate it out, and if they would have gotten penalties that dropped them below 1, you can't combine them. But of course, you can do plinking fires with both of them at different targets. Opportunity range is always 2 hexes for op fire for artillery. Melee artillery can't attack, but they defend as normal. They've got a special exception for unlimbered artillery being attacked from the rear. I don't know what that is. And artillery can sit in the squares. Artillery, when it's disorganized, treated very much like the other units. It's got to be limbered. Anything exciting here? If it's even attacked in melee, when it's disorganized, it's going to be automatically eliminated unless it's stacked with infantry. Disorganized infantry, because otherwise they can't be stacked together. And they say there's an optional rule because of their density. Again, like I say, game kit in terms of the amount of different choices you have on how to play this. And, you know, to some extent, they're pretty extreme. Artillery fire did not have the same effect when target was infantry in close order when it was lone artillery battery. Okay, so this is gonna, and this comes with a couple of options of its own as to how you're gonna do damage to artillery versus artillery fire. All right. Let's go through stacking and then we'll take a break. Stacking. 10 steps of infantry and artillery, or up to 7 steps of cav. You can't mix them, it looks like. If cav must enter a hexa occupied by infantry or artillery, or vice versa, the 2 stacks are both disorganized and both retreat 2 hexes. And I guess they don't stay stacked. If a stack is disorganized, it executes an additional 1 to 2 hex retreat. At the end of movement, the prohibition against stacking cav with other types of units must be adhered to, and this can cause somebody to have additional retreats. Okay, in combat, only the top unit can fire. Hey, that sounds real familiar. A stack can attack only one hex. It can't split its fire. All units in the stack take part in melee, however. However, if a unit has melee of 0, it does not take part in the melee, but it suffers any combat results of DD defender losses or an elimination. If the melee is a morale test, the first unit with a positive melee value in the stack checks. So this is very similar to other games. The base stacking is, only the top unit is going to take combat, etc. But again, because this is more, this is just filled with options, there are other ways of playing. Step losses are applied to the top unit. Yeah. And then we have exceptions here. If you're 0 melee, you don't take that hit. If you're eliminated, if the top unit's eliminated, losses carry over to the next unit in the line. I think that's one of the things that changes is who takes the losses. I think it's decided that you're no longer set up like one unit in front of the other, but that you're actually all covering the space to some extent. The top unit makes the morale check. If it fails, the next unit makes a morale check modified by -2. And and I think the next unit is modified by -4, if I recall correctly. I think there's an example of that. I'm not sure. The concept stacked on top, therefore in front, is just an easy way to explain why the top unit checks morale and fires. If you're fired from the rear, you still take it on the top unit. Yeah. As you can see, it's a serious abstraction there. Stacking an op fire. So if a unit leaves the hex and exits to the rear, leaving other units in the hex, it's subject to opportunity fire no matter where the fire comes from. The static top unit does not do any screening. The triggering event is simply the exiting of the hex. If this triggers a morale test, the entire stack performs it because the hex is the target. Yeah, which unit? The one that just got shot or the one on top? I don't know. At the end of the movement phase, units stacked together and with the same formation must have common facing. If they're in different formations, they can have different facings, but they must share at least 2 front hexes, and this is the mixed order. Front hexes and flank rear hexes are determined with respect to the whole stack, not individual units. Exceptions: a unit in square can't stack with an infantry in any other formation. Skirmishers can only stack with skirmishers. We don't have skirmishers. Yeah, not yet. We will. They're later, they're in the optional rules. If 2 units at any end of phase stack together but not with compatible facings, they both take a morale check. And if both succeed, the player must change the facing of a unit to obey the rule. If they fail, well, they disorganize and run away. Disorganized units can't be stacked with other formations except during a retreat, or a voluntary move toward a line of communication, which is sort of a retreat. In either case, the good order unit checks morale. The disorganized unit can't stay in the hex. I think it would be allowed to if the other unit disorganizes and retreats out of it, but that's just me. Stacking: who's up and who is down. You can change the order of units only during your movement or charge phases, except for artillery moving down upon infantry square formation. Yeah, so the designer's French, and like with the Azor Wish games, there's definitely odd phraseology being used at times, and it's kind of hard to figure out what that means, but whatever. These changes are free. I think it's artillery hiding in the square, essentially. However you want to word that. Okay, we'll take a break before we get to movement. And mark that with this. All right, back to the rules. Movement, nothing too astounding here. It's funny how many pages, you have to go through just to explain the movement of your standard war game. Your hex and counter type game. And sometimes there are, little differences. Here we've got our formation effects and movement point cost, basically taken off the terrain effects chart. Now, The problem, of course, is that terrain effects chart is complex enough that it's going to take some time to get used to what the movement effects are. One assumes it's normal movement for clear terrain, but then we got to look up, hey, do roads have an effect, and when do they have an effect? And they don't. Column limbered and disorganized units are able to use roads to ignore obstacles, and if you do all your movement on road, you get a bonus of 2 movement points. Cost for formation changes that aren't mandatory. Facing changes, we've already talked about it. You get you can move a hex whenever you are crossing another hex side. You can change formation either just before or just after for free, and then each other, either hex side or vertex, depending on which way you're facing, is going to cost you an extra movement point. Special cost, though, 180-degree counter march is 2 movement points for any formation, which I think puts a maximum on the number of movement points you can spend on a formation change. Anything else here? Artillery can only move when they're limbered. Certain terrains are unavailable to them. Okay, cavalry withdrawal. If a good order cavalry is not performing a charge, it can retreat 1 or 2 hexes as soon as an enemy unit enters an adjacent hex. So immediately you're saying, well, why would I ever use that disorder roll? That's a way of preventing a charge. If you're in the midst of a charge, you can actually blow your cav that way, intentionally. When you do this, you have to make a morale check, and if you succeed, you displace. If you don't succeed, you're disorganized, which includes a retreat. Fire. Remember, fire is baked into the sequence of play. Defensive fire, offensive fire. Infantry firepower is always constant. It's not going to matter how many hits you take on a unit. It's an interesting concept, because the idea is that basically you'd still put the same frontage up. You just have lost some of your mass to the units. I'm not sure I believe that in all cases. Lines were extended, sometimes to cover thin areas, but as an abstraction, overall it probably suits pretty well. Artillery firepower is halved if the artillery loses one of its 2 levels. And there's going to be some optional rules on artillery losses, as we said before. Losses of levels are marked right on the chart here. I'm going to try using a grease pencil. I've noticed with the tissue, it cleans up with a little bit of liquid. So rather than photocopy the sheet, I figure I don't mind if it gets a little marked. Just a little gray ends up on a sheet. The paper is a fairly glossy stock, so I thought that would work. And it looks like it will. Range, general infantry range is 1 hex. Opportunity fire is a 2 hex range for units that have it. For artillery units that have it. It's 1 hex for even 2 hex infantry fire. And then you have a zone of fire coming out your front, like in a lot of games. Okay, so you calculate the firepower, and let me see. I'm seeing if units fire as a combined point. If several units fire together, they must combine their firepower into a single value. Yeah, it's the same as most games. And then you're going to roll here on the fire table. If you get a number, that's how many step losses the enemy takes. If you get an asterisk, and there are a few of them on the verge there, it means the target takes no step losses but has to make a morale check. If you take a step loss, you do have to make morale. The only exception is towns and castles. Prevent you from having to take one. You're allowed to do opportunity fire whenever a unit leaves a hex into which you could fire. Basically, they're skipping, your chance in the sequence of play to shoot at them. You may end up generating lots of opportunity fire. This is not available when an enemy unit just changes facing or adopts a new formation unless they're moving through it. The thing I showed you where, A retreating unit doesn't have to check morale if it's fired upon during the retreat. If units move stacked together, there's only one opportunity fire that they generate, and it hits their top unit, just like it would regular hitting a stack. And you're op fired when you leave a hex, even there's no screening for units. Line of sight. All right. Line of sight can always be a little tricky. It doesn't look like it's going to be too hard here. Cannot cross wood, brush, castle, or town. Swamps and difficult terrain do not block the line of sight unless specified. Ridges block line of sight. A hex occupied by any unit. And this is blocked if it crosses the hex where the unit is, not just if it crosses the unit counter, because the units don't completely fill the hex on the map. These terrain block even if you have height advantages, but fire is possible from these blocking hexes or to these hexes with modifiers in some cases, yeah. So you're able to, shoot into the woods or out of the woods. There might be a penalty for doing so. A ridge line is located on the hex side, even if the artwork does not follow the hex side, yeah. Okay, so it's a pretty simple line of sight, very restrictive. Nothing too, if there's blocking terrain, it blocks. Okay, losses, like I said, are going to be recorded here by unit. And this is kind of a clever little design here. So you've got the unit name here. You've got how many hits it takes. I don't know what that blue number means. Probably some kind of morale loss factor that I'm not aware of. And then you've got this ID number running down the side. That ID number is on every counter. And each scenario has its own set of counters by ID, and they're actually completely exclusive for the units. The leaders in the scenarios I have to have in a separate bag, and I have them out here. Is this as good? Is this better than what, say, GMT does by just putting the particular battle on the counter? Yeah, I don't know. We'll see, because it's going to be easier to look up by the unit ID than it will be by the actual unit name, right? So I think it's going to be a pretty helpful little innovation there. Okay. So they make the option of using the numeric counters that you're using for disruption, disorder, as combat numeric counters as well. I'm going to try to avoid that. I've always been pretty happy with recording losses on a sheet, and it doesn't affect your fire values, so you're going to have less lookups than you would in most games. You do have to make lookups to decide if you're going to make a charge, though. Whenever you take a failed morale check, you're disorganized, you retreat 2 hexes. We've already heard this. When you fire against square, you get a +1 to fire against it. And we have the formation modifiers there. Okay, melee. During your melee phase, you can attack adjacent enemy units, and the melee value is going to be based on the step strength. Okay. You can attack each unit once per melee phase, but it can be attacked by several units. Charges and countercharges are a special case, and we'll get to them. They have a lot of specialties, but for example, a retreating unit can trigger a countercharge. Stacks in melee, you can't split a stack. You have to melee with it as an integral value. The melee value is modified, the formation, and the defender's terrain modify the melee value. And that's going to be listed here. We have a fire combat. I think these are die roll modifiers on that table. Over here, we're going to be talking about strength modifiers for the most part. I think where they say, do they ever say not value? Yeah, I think these are all value based, which is going to modify the strength of the unit. And you'll see the melee comes out to be a combat ratio as opposed to a firepower table, which works. All pretty standard stuff. If a unit's modified melee value is 0, the unit's not in the melee and it'll take no losses if it's attacking. If it's a defending unit, it's ignored, but it's for combat resolution, but it suffers any results. You take the modified melee value and multiply it by the number of steps. Okay, well, modified melee value is probably usually going to be 1. Oh no, the melee value is going to be modified by the terrain. Okay, I thought it was going to be 1. Let's see. The unit's modified melee. Yeah. Okay. The melee value is printed on the counter. So it's this value here, and then it's modified by the number of steps, or it's multiplied by the number of steps. Wow, those are going to be kind of big numbers sometimes. You can only attack through your front hexes. You get a modifier. A unit attacked from the rear has its melee value reduced by half, and morale checks at a penalty if it is required. And that's if you take any attacks from behind. Flank or rear attack does not apply if any defending unit is attacked from front hexes only. Yeah. So if you're in a mixed order, if any unit's being hit from the front in that stack, and remember, they're mostly aligned to face in the same direction. That unit's kind of covering. Yeah. If a unit is attacked through a flank or rear, its flank or rear can be protected if that unit is in front of another friendly unit. And we get an example here. So, except if Z is unfriendly artillery. So here we have 2 units, X and Z. This reminds me of the malicious man-in-the-middle attacks and stuff like that, the little diagrams for that. X and Z look like they're on the same side. Y is, I believe, attacking X here with a flank attack, but Y is in Z's frontal hex, which means that the flank and rear values do not apply. So if you've got somebody covering you at all, they don't have to have a continuous line. So that's kind of going to be interesting to see how that actually plays out. Unlimbered artillery, if it's attacked from a flank or rear, the combat result applies to the defending artillery only. Any 0 or 1 result is replaced by a D. Looks like disorganized. All other combat results are applied normally. I'm wondering why they're likely to be disorganized rather than overrun. Artillery stacked with infantry. If the artillery is stacked with infantry and it's attacked through flank or rear, it doesn't participate. But if the infantry is disorganized or eliminated, the artillery takes the same result. Some units can't attack in melee. Infantry in square, cav in column. Artillery in general disorganized. Okay, so the attacker divides his melee strength by the defender's melee strength. They get a ratio. It'll be rounded in favor of the defender. A die is rolled. What kind of die do we use in this game? I assume it's a 6-sider. Yeah. And the combat result from the melee table is applied. A 0 or a 1 is going to be step losses. A star is a morale check. D is an automatic disorganization. D1 is a disorganization and a step loss. And an E is an elimination. And this will be split into an attacker-defender results into 2 columns under each value. When you're disorganized, you have to retreat. There's going to be some disruption if you have to retreat through friendly units. They have to check morale. You have to face stacking. It can cause opportunity fire. If you leave the map when disorganized, you count as eliminated. Advances after combat. I think this is only for melee. Yeah. The attacker has the option to advance after combat. They don't have to. All right. Now we get to complicated stuff. Cav charges. And cav are going to always be complicated in a Napoleonic game. This one has a fairly simple design. Cav has considerable melee strength when charging. And you'll see that by the numbers, the 5 combat. Cav charges occur before the other unit's movements. Be aware that the rules applying to charge and countercharge contain many exceptions to other rules. So to attack, the cav must charge. This move is performed during the cav charge phase. To make a regular move, the cav moves during the movement phase. The units having performed a move or charge with no move during the charge phase cannot make a regular move during the movement phase. The charging units will melee during the melee phase. Not sure how you mark that a charge is in progress. I think there's the back of, maybe the squares have, back of the squares have little charge markers on them. We'll look at these because these are kind of interesting. They're not all used in the base game. So we'll see where we go here. All right. So the cav formation for a regular move is column or general order. For a charge, it's always line. There's no cost to change formation. Cav unit may opt to stay in column or general order formation, or it may attempt, this is on defense, or it may attempt to countercharge. If it countercharges, the defending cav becomes the attacker, basically, in order to see what, whether when the strike happens. It can also choose to become disorganized or retreat if attacked by infantry. During the charge phase, the active player states which units will attempt to charge, but he doesn't state what enemy units are being targeted. The charging cav may not be disorganized. Charges don't have to all be declared at once. Players can decide during the charge phase if charges actually start or not. On the other hand, a declared charge must be performed. The charge is going to be a normal movement, but only 2 60-degree orientation changes can be performed. That's one hex side. Each orientation change will cost you 2 movement points. Each unit can change only 60 degrees once per hex. There's no free orientation change. Entering a village or woods costs 6 movement points, brush 4, and difficult terrain or farm 2. If the unit starts its move in such terrain, it pays this cost immediately before it starts its charge. Costing a stream costs 6, climbing a ridge costs 2, and going down has 2 also. Do we have, yeah, we have cav charge costs, because that's a complex set of things to try to remember. Like I said, the terrain effects chart is filled with information. A charging cav can pass through non-charging friendly cav as long as the stacking limits are respected. Charging cav cannot cross a gully or a marsh and cannot enter a castle or cross fortified walls. This is all in that thing. There can be different costs and rules on each battle. It doesn't need a line of sight in order to make a charge. With 30-minute turns, some games have that, and it always feels a little weird that like orders couldn't be, hey, the enemy's over here. But on the other hand, it tries to maintain some limitation on the power of the cav. Each charge will be resolved separately, yet if several cav are stacked at the beginning of the charge phase, they can charge together. They can also come from several different hexes, as long as the attacker declares, well, as long as the charger declares he's doing a combined charge. Leader can charge with the cav if he's stacked with them at the beginning. Otherwise, he can't, and he won't be allowed to move further if he does. Okay. If during the cav movement, the cav happens to be in the neighborhood of an enemy cavalry facing in the right direction, the enemy cavalry can attempt a countercharge by checking morale. If the destination hex contains at least 1 infantry, the defender can try to form square. That'll be a morale check. This really reminds me, I don't remember what the system is. Fire and Fury, maybe? Or was that a Civil War one? I remember playing a very simple... Yeah, that's Civil War. I remember playing a very simple mini system that really reminds me of how this design works. Now, this doesn't sound all that simple, but when it plays, I think it will be. When a charging cav moves, the owning player can state which hex the cav will attack, if and when he wants. Of course, a cav in line formation has 2 front hexes and can attack either. Charging can voluntarily become disorganized at any time. You can blow the cav, including after combat, to retreat 2 hexes. The game turn marker placed on the cav will be the previous game turn number. In this case, this is to allow them to recover more quickly. Remember, that's the turn that you got disorganized. Well, because this is voluntary, it's basically a cav recall, and it's easier to reorganize. A charge ends in either melee, losing a morale check, or voluntary disorganization. Once a unit starts a charge, it cannot voluntarily stop it except by disorg. If it fails to make contact, it disorganizes voluntarily automatically. Unless the target has been vacated due to other causes, a morale failure after fire, for example. Then disorganization is not mandatory. The cav simply comes back to its column face if no melee occurs. If the charge movement stops voluntarily, the cav will be disordered, however. If it stops for other reasons, as if there is no target left, then the disorganization is optional, depending on whether you want to withdraw. There's no morale check to charge in general. There may be some units that have that, but there is one for countercharge. And when you charge, the combat will be resolved during the melee phase. And the cav fights with usual procedures with all the modifiers that apply. Value reduced to 1 when attacking a square, for example. However, a countercharge will be resolved immediately as soon as it's declared. If the target of the charge contains no enemy unit, or only markers or leaders, the melee is considered over. The cav comes back to its column face or can disorganize. I'm sorry I have to read through these more carefully, but these are kind of weirder rules. When applying the combat results, the infantry targeted by a charge loses 1 additional step unless it's in square or general order, or if it took no step losses. Now, see 9.6. Let's see if that's a 0 result. No, that's the square. So the real question there is how specific are these rules being? So, yeah, a D would cause an additional loss, I believe, and there's no asterisk alone. It's fair enough. Let's see where we are. Remember, a disorganized unit which gets a D is eliminated. At the end of melee, every cav unit involved in a charge and not performing an exploitation reverts to column formation or general order if they're in bad terrain, obeying the rule about facing with at least 2 front hexes in common. Okay, if a charge is resolved, the target unit is disorganized or eliminated, the disorganized unit retreats 2 hexes. The cav unit can enter the combat hex, change its orientation by 60 degrees or more, and then initiate another melee if there's an enemy unit directly in front of it. If the new enemy unit is infantry, it has a chance to form square as the cav is pushing through. If the infantry cannot see it, no square attempt is possible. They would have to not be able to see it just before it hits. And that's basically if you're hitting blocking terrain, line of sight blocking terrain, with your cav, which probably isn't pleasant terrain for you to hit with your cav, a unit beyond that terrain. So let's say this is blocking, which I don't think it is. Well, it is because it's up on a hill. So an infantry unit here, a cav unit here, if the cav is hitting an enemy unit here, and it knocks it out, then the cav would get to push into here. This infantry wouldn't be able to see through here. That's how I read that rule. And then it wouldn't get a chance to change to square. The new infantry unit can be engaged in melee with another attack, and the exploiting cavalry will simply join this other attack, which may make the order of melees important. At the end of the exploitation phase, the cavalry can enter the new empty hex, but there's no further exploitation. You get 1 charge through. Okay, combined charges. You can combine with several cav from different hexes. These cav do not have to meet on a single hex as long as they attack the same target. This rule allows the cavalry to fight together if countercharged. The defender must wait for all the moves to be done before declaring a countercharge, when the cavs can move and fight as a whole. The units do not have to declare a combined charge in order to melee together at the same target. The combined charge is to avoid being countercharged piecemeal. Infantry can form square anytime during the charge. Infantry that's not in square will take additional step losses. We talked about that. Trying to form a square, you make a morale check with all modifiers except the -2 for being attacked from a flank rear hex. There are people watching behind to warn you about cav. Okay. The morale check is modified by the distance from the charging cav. If this distance is 3 or more, you get a bonus of 1, otherwise you don't. If the cav is adjacent to the target, you can't attempt to form square. The infantry is going to be charged. The line of sight might be important. If the cav is 3 hexes away, but is seen only at 2 hexes, the last will be used as the morale check. If the morale check succeeds, the infantry takes a square formation, at which point maybe the cav doesn't want to hit and blows, which would be your standard reaction to a square. Busting through a square is really tough in this game. I remember the minis game that I played. Busting through squares was a little too easy. The one that I was comparing this to. I don't remember what it's called. Players in the can freely move artillery up or down the pile during square formation, but they can't change the artillery formation. So the idea here is to hide the artillery inside the square. In which case it's protected. If it's unlimbered, If it's stacked on the infantry, it can only use half its fire value against the cav. And if the cav actually melees the hex, the artillery will take at least one step loss no matter what the melee result. If the artillery will have no morale bonus due to being stacked with the square, but if attacked by the cavalry, this cavalry melee value is still reduced to 1. Unlimbered artillery stacked under the infantry can only take part in melee, and it doesn't fire, but it does get the +2 bonus. If a morale check fails, the infantry is disorganized, but it doesn't retreat. It'll retreat after the charge has been resolved, unless it no longer exists. And that's going to be tough to remember. Again, you have to look at the charge things and understand, you look at what turn the disorder happened, and you can probably remember from those pieces of information. If several infantry are stacked together, the top unit checks morale. If successful, the whole stack adopts the square. If it fails, it becomes disorganized, and the second unit checks morale with -2 to form square. If all hexes fail, they remain in place and wait for the melee. If some units pass the morale check, the others have to retreat before the cav hits, because you can't have disordered and ordered units in the same hex. Okay, countercharges. Enemy cav can attempt to countercharge. This can happen during charge movement and also during the melee phases. This is a charge without movement, available only to the enemy cav. However, it can happen during player A's turn if a unit from B retreats after melee and passes in front of a non-charging cav belonging to A. Essentially, it's the non-moving player in any given situation. It's not terribly well explained, but that's okay. I think the gist comes across well enough that you can figure it out. Exception, a cav that's already being charged and chose not to countercharge cannot countercharge another enemy unit passing in its front, as it's already engaged in that first charge. If a unit enters one of the front hexes of an enemy cavalry unit, this cavalry can attempt to countercharge. It must first check morale. If it fails, nothing happens, and the countercharge just doesn't happen. The unit can keep operating. If the morale check succeeds, the countercharging cavalry changes to line, but some terrain penalties may apply, in particular if you're sitting in the wrong terrain. Then it immediately engages the enemy in melee without moving. The countercharging cavalry is the attacker for the resolution of the countercharge only. If infantry is countercharged, it cannot form square, i.e., so you don't want to be marching towards cav, as the cav is now adjacent to the infantry. A stack of cav units can also countercharge as one unit, pending all units passing their morale check. Only the units that pass can countercharge. If the top unit fails its morale check, the unit under checks at -2 for a regular morale check. As the countercharge is not normal movement, it does not trigger opportunity fire. And as the melee is resolved before the fire phase, the countercharge unit cannot fire. Yeah, there's some weirdness going on here, but okay. Because you're marching, so I mean, why would you stop and fire? Well, it is a 30-minute turn, so hard to do. Several units can countercharge at the same time. They can combine their melee value for a single melee. All units currently stacked with the moving unit are countercharged. I think there's no counter charges, which would just cause this to be a complete mess. Beware of combined charges when you have several units around, several units in one charge, because they are a big stack to countercharge. The countercharging cav does not move after combat, and it reverts to its formation. No matter what the combat result, the countercharge stops the active unit's movement. The charging cavalry reverts to column or general order, i.e. if you're countercharging a charging cav. You can countercharge other things. Its actions are over for the turn, which means for this present turn it's free to move or change at its next turn. An infantry, if countercharged, can engage in melee during its next melee phase. A cav which failed its countercharge attempt will still be able to attempt other countercharges if a new possibility arises. If several cav are stacked together, and if some of them fail the countercharge morale check, they're ignored during the countercharge. They don't But they will have to check morale if the countercharging cavalries were disorganized. They don't get displaced out of the hex or anything because they're not actually having a morale effect from that check. It's just whether or not they go. A cav can initiate an unlimited number of countercharges per turn, but only once per action, triggering a countercharge. All right, time for another break. And yeah, I know this is going to be a long video because we have to go over all the different leadership options for the game and all the optional roles. We're most of the way through the game. Most of it, other than cav charges, is fairly standardized, and I've been probably too long-winded given how much video I've used up. The morale checks come from fire, melee, basically whenever you take losses, if you're attempting countercharge, if you're attempting to form to square, and they have different effects. You roll 2 dice, and if you roll less than or equal to the morale value, the check succeeds. And morale value is, let's see, what's this number? Let's see, yeah, that would be a 2 die value. If you roll greater, the unit becomes disorganized. Yeah, not always. It must retreat 2 hexes. So, if you fail a rally, you're allowed to retreat towards forests or towns. And we'll see that on the rally phase. That's also done with a morale check. 2s always succeed, 12s always fail, no matter what modifiers you have. You have a bunch of modifiers. If you're already disorganized, you take a penalty. If you're in square, attacked by cav, you get a bonus. If you have adjacent, if you're attempting to rally adjacent to an enemy, you have a penalty. Leaders give you a bonus. Being attacked from bad directions gives you a penalty. And multiple, yeah, this is where it specifies it out. Multiple failed morale checks in 1 hex keep giving you penalty off 1 action. If you lose several steps, your morale can be lowered. On the army sheet, when you get to a colored box, then the morale is lowered by 1. Now, what's not clear there is okay, so there's a table that indicates this, so we can look it up and see what that generally says. So this is a 4-strength unit, so yeah, that's the colored box. What's not clear to me is what it means to say the losses have reached the gray box. I think it's you get an X in that gray box, rather than that you've taken losses and now you've reached the gray box or colored box. Again, wordings are not terribly clear in these rules. This is a time for me to mention something I've often had mentioned, which is that American rules tend to be tighter than most other countries for whatever reason. I'm not sure about German rules, but I know that the English used to complain about Americans being too much rules lawyer-ish, wanting things to be really nailed down. I'm okay with them not, but I feel here that I'm kind of missing something important, that I could be playing it wrong and really be either significantly weakening or strengthening units' capability to stand in a situation. I don't know how much I care. Okay. During the rally phase, you're allowed to rally your disorganized units. So it takes 2 full turns before you're allowed to make a rally attempt. The marker has to be 2 lower than the current turn marker. I'm not sure that's 2 full turns. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay. I'm just making sure that I understand it. When you rally, you make a morale check, including the -2 disorganized modifier. You don't have to do it. If you succeed, you're no longer disorganized. If you fail, you retreat 2 hexes, and you don't get destroyed. It's not like Great Battles of History where rally checks fail you. It could happen that units are disorganized on different turns in the same stack. If one unit reorganizes and another is still disorganized, the disorganized unit has to keep retreating, even if it's in Woodertown. All right, now we start coming to the cool stuff. Army morale. Each battle, armies are going to have a certain number of losses that they can take, and you add the losses taken and the number of currently disorganized units and compare this to the demoralization level and desperation level. When these are reached, the army or corps morale starts collapsing. And this might be differentiated on a per corps basis for the particular battle. When you're demoralized, each unit has a morale -1. When the army is demoralized, everything immediately checks morale. This is a one-time check. If the corps recovers good morale because it rallies units and then becomes again demoralized, it doesn't take the full morale check again. It's only the first time that it hits. When you hit desperation thresholds, morale is permanently modified by -2. And each unit makes an immediate morale check. Again, a one-time check. When a unit is... Now, what's weird here is that this says permanent, and then it does say that the corps recovers better morale because it rallies units and then becomes again desperate. There's no morale check. I'm not sure which is meant. Is there a permanent effect to going desperate, or is it a one-time, or is this statement about the test being a one-time thing a mistake meant to that's there to confuse? And I can go either way with it. The rules as written seem to indicate that it is indeed permanent and that this is just some superfluous words, but obviously you can't just take rules as written. You have to try to discern the designer's intent. I have the feeling that it is intended to be permanent, however, that this part is probably an artifact of editing. When a unit in a desperate corps is disorganized, it can trigger a chain reaction. Every adjacent unit immediately checks morale, and then this goes to everything adjacent to the 2-hex retreat path. If these morale checks fail, the corresponding units are themselves disorganized, and they can cause further chain reaction. But this chain reaction does not apply during the mandatory morale check. Every unit's checking. So, okay. Reinforcements come in the map as movement. I think they come in, one unit after the other. Generally considered to be broad movement off map. Leaders. Now, you're noticing there's no command rules yet. They're in the optional rules, every last one of them. Each player has 1 leader per army corps, plus some army commander. Leaders give benefits. Leaders influence combat and morale checks. Okay, the leader counters have 3 numerical values. Let's grab us an excellent leader such as Joseph. Okay, so the left number is going to be his combat bonus. The right number or center number, the center number is going to be his morale bonus, and the right number is going to be his movement allowance. And then on the back we have a little picture. Oh. Sorry, this is Jordan. I thought it was Joseph. It starts with a J. My eyes aren't good. The first 2 values are going to be added to the die roll, and the final one is simply used to move him. using infantry costs during movement phase, which are cheaper than cav costs, so it's not a problem. The leader can move by himself, join a pile. Okay, the combat bonus is for melee only. It doesn't affect fire. And it's added to the die roll when he attacks and subtracted when he defends. It's only added to units the leader commands. Thus, the army commander can bonus any units in his army. Individual corps or whatever commanders only bonus the command is under them. This is optional. You can choose not to use it unless it's negative for some reason. You have to decide before rolling the dice, though. Leaders have to check for survival if their stack is eliminated. Napoleon has a very small combat bonus because you would be misusing him in any of the battles covered in this era to use him as a tactical leader. This is a little weird because actually he probably would be really potent, but yeah. In the sense that if he was attacked, the troops around him would really rally to his cause and help defend him. But as an overall abstraction, you know, if they're cutting through to Napoleon, it's pretty bad. So, leader provides morale bonuses. This is just added to the stacked unit's morale. Again, only if they're in command of that, only if they're under the command structure of that leader. Notice Napoleon has a 6 morale bonus, so if he is stacked with units, they're not going to break easily. Leader's eliminated if he's in a unit that loses 2 to 3 steps. You roll another die on a 6 he dies. Or if he's in a stack that's eliminated, and again, roll on a 6 he dies. If he's alone in a hex and an enemy walks on him. If he's totally surrounded by enemy units and is the lone survivor of a fight, a 4, 5, or 6 eliminates him. If he survives, he jumps 2 hexes away. Several elimination cases apply simultaneously. You roll multiple dice before any other tests that might be required. If the army commander is eliminated, his army may immediately become demoralized based on special rules. Yeah. If Napoleon dies in the game, the French player loses the game. This is not as bad as the Gamers NBS series Austerlitz, where if you get Napoleon killed, you're banned from wargaming ever again. I was afraid to ever play the French for that. Substitute leaders. When the leader's killed, you get a new one, and there's you flip the counter over to indicate that the counter's killed. Now the reverse side should show an initiative value. This is not a leader. Okay, the reverse side shows an initiative value. I think there are replacement leader counters that have these values. Combat bonus 0, morale bonus +1, movement allowance 10. Okay. Initiative is going to be used in some of the optional roles. If the substitute leader has killed himself, you get other substitutes, but this won't bring any victory points. Lines of communication. This is going to be your main retreat path for the units, and it basically just gives you a direction. Okay. Now, there's a set of advanced rules which are basically, hey, this is a pretty simple game so far. Now let's start making, choose the game you like. Okay, Voltigos. If you use this rule, you don't use the Tiralia formation. That was the 2-hex formation. Instead, you're going to be deploying infantry. Infantry units can deploy Voltigos. These are implemented by using numerical markers, the loss markers, which unfortunately are marked with a 5-point difference instead of the usual 1-point difference. So it was very hard for me to sort, and it's going to be hard for me to remember that point value. I'm so used to the convention of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rather than 1, 6, 2, 7. This may actually make sense because used as demoralization markers, they're going to be kind of clustered together. But used as loss markers, they make more sense split out. Anyway, let's keep going. Now, this game actually provides what look like skirmisher markers, and I think they may be described as such, but they're not explained in the rules. But you could use them instead. Okay. A line infantry in column or general order can deploy 1 voltigeur. A line infantry in line can deploy 2, and the light infantry can be broken into 3. A disorganized unit, a unit in square, or a militia cannot deploy any. A unit cannot deploy more voltigeurs than the number of lost steps they have left. These markers are part of the mother unit, so they do not subtract losses when they're deployed. They only simulate the presence of the voltigeurs. They can be deployed in any terrain where the movement is allowed. They're deployed in any hex where the mother unit can fire, except for light infantry, where they're deployed in any adjacent hex. So you can put them out your ass. Only the upper unit in a stack can deploy voltigeurs. They do not block line of sight. So they just become a cloud of skirmishers, which sounds more reasonable than the other simplified version. To deploy and reintegrate voltigeurs does not cost any movement points. This action is voluntary. They fire with a firepower of 1. This value is not modified. Fire on a unit beyond the voltigeur is made with a negative value, because it'll be, it's essentially screening the unit, unless this value is already 1. Several voltigeurs on the path only decrease by 1 total. Line of sight is not blocked by them. Voltigeurs cannot stack with enemy units. If 2 voltigeurs are in the same hex, essentially, they both disappear. They are reabsorbed. They're stacked on a unit, they're simply ignored. They are essentially reintegrated. When an enemy infantry or artillery enters a voltigeur hex, that triggers an opportunity fire if they enter from a front hex. And then the voltigeurs flee back and are reintegrated in their unit. If the infantry enters preceded by its voltigeur, then the 2 voltigeurs from the opposite sides annihilate each other and no opportunity fire is performed. So if you have your skirmishers, which is deployed. If an enemy cav enters a hex adjacent to a voltigeur, the voltigeur reintegrates with no fire. Practically, the movement of the mother unit is made first, then the voltigeurs follow and are set around. If any opportunity fire occurs. So basically what these are is just a cloud of 1-point firing units. Now, I believe they can't combine their fire or anything. Yeah, they cannot be added to another voltigeur fire, and 1 can be added to regular fire. And remember, if they're in the same hex as their parent, they just don't count. Artillery fire didn't have the same effect when the target was infantry in close order or firing an artillery battery with less men. There's 2 flavors to this, A and B. A is half losses. Every time an artillery is fired on by enemy artillery, its losses are tallied as half losses. The first time the fire table indicates there's a step loss, the artillery suffers only half a step loss, and a single bar, not a cross, is drawn over on the loss sheet. The artillery values are affected in no way by this half loss. Half loss triggers a normal morale check, however. The next time the artillery takes a half loss, it fills that square out. If the artillery is stacked on infantry, the first step loss is applied to the artillery, and therefore only half applies, and then any remaining step losses are applied to the infantry as full step losses. This is when artillery is firing on artillery. And the morale check is executed by the artillery. If the first attack is a combined attack by infantry and artillery, the half-loss rules apply if the artillery provides half the total firepower or more. All right, the next is random losses. Each time artillery fires on friendly artillery, on it, whatever, enemy really. If the artillery is alone in the hex, 1 through 3, the fire is effective, otherwise it's ignored. On a 2 to 3, losses required, a die is rolled for each step loss that's required. If the artillery is stacked with infantry, roll a die for the first step loss. If the attack is combined fire, use the same rule as step B. And, it's whether you want to track half losses or roll more dice. And I don't know. The natural effect is about the same. The question is, well, is this a per gun loss or is it something else? And I think the units are big enough that it's probably not a per gun loss. It's a pro rating. So I think I'd favor the half losses over the random losses, just in terms of the mechanical complexity of the actions. Normally I like randomness in a game, because I think it makes sense. But here, it's probably not individual cannon being destroyed or not destroyed, right, by the one die roll. So I'd rather have some losses be taken. So I prefer both the deterministic, both in terms of what it's representing and in terms of the mechanical complexity. But if you really don't like writing half losses on the chart, well, this is an alternative. And this is the thing. I have the feeling a lot of these optional rules have been tweaked with, and one person wants one way, one person wants another, and the designer just said, "Well, let's go with both." Artillery retreat gets especially silly with the orders rules. Limbered artillery retreats normally if disorganized. Unlimbered artillery does not retreat. It stays where it is, and they get a turn marker across the counter, but they don't retreat the counter. An artillery disorganized in this fashion can rally normally. The other units in the hex act as if the artillery had left the hex, and they ignore it. But if the enemy enters the hex, the artillery will be eliminated. During movement phase the following turn, the artillery can retreat as a regular disorganized unit does, and then it limbers. Basically, that's to indicate that you've chased the crew away, and if they don't limber the guns, they're not going to get them out of there. Cavalry. Okay, special rules to make cavalry a little bit more complex. They're a light cav. If they have a movement allowance of 10 or more, they do not need to pass a morale check to retreat before combat. They can do this as many times as they like, and they can change direction 3 times instead of twice during charge. They get a +1 die roll modifier when meleeing against disorganized units. Line cavalry. If they have a movement allowance of 9, they have to make a morale check to retreat before combat. They can change direction twice per charge movement, and they get a +1 die roll modifier in melee against light cavalry. I don't know what they do against disorganized units. I guess they're the normal there. They get a -1 if they're countercharged by light cavalry, the defensive bonus. Heavy cav. These have a movement allowance of 8 or less. They can change direction only once per charge movement. When they charge, their die roll is modified by +1, except when charging against heavy cavalry. Now, here's the problem. This is not in the play aids. The play aids are for the basic game. And I'm probably going to have to make annotations to this chart, which makes it a shame that it's glossy, or else make a little cheat sheet of all the different optional rules that I'm playing with and what their effects are. This rule does not apply to countercharge. Well, it does up here. Opportunity charge. Light cav can perform an opportunity charge 2 hexes away. This procedure is identical to a countercharge, but only if the enemy unit, remember, countercharge only happens at 1 hex range, which is why units don't move. But only if the enemy unit becomes adjacent to a front hex of the countercharging unit. Adjacent to a front hex. So if I'm here, these are my front hexes. If they're in my front arc, I can do this opportunity charge. At that time, there is an empty hex between them. After the morale check for countercharging, the unit advances a hex, and then it immediately resolved as a countercharge. When the charge is over, whatever the result, the light or heavy cavalry can become disorganized, but not line. Huh. What's up with that? I'm not sure why line can't. I'm a little disturbed by that. I don't think that's intended. It must retreat towards the lines of communication. The length of the retreat is 2 hexes or the number of remaining movement points. Okay. I think probably there wasn't a line cavalry option at one point, and we're seeing the light and heavy being distinguished there. Rout. Rout can be used by players who think that the disorganization of a unit already disorganized does not mean its elimination, but its rout. The rout rules make rally more difficult, and it takes into account stragglers. I, of course, like this kind of rule. A unit that's already disorganized taking a new disorganization will be routed. It'll take 2 markers equal to the current turn number plus 2. And this is going to make it harder for them to reorganize, because remember, it's like 2 full turns after your marker. The unit retreats with its whole movement allowance towards the lines of communication, and will do so at the same time. Will do the same each time it fails a rally morale check. Its morale is -3. Its fire value and melee value are 0s, and it moves normally, but only towards lines of communication. Its front covers all 6 hexes. If an enemy unit enters one of those front 6 hexes, the routed unit retreats with its full movement towards its line of communication. Failing that, it retreats on any free hex. If it fails this too, it's eliminated. If the routed unit passes through a non-routed unit, it contaminates this unit, and the other unit becomes routed too without a morale check. And that works both ways. Morale in town, fortified farm, and castle. If these are too powerful, yeah, I think so. A unit in the town has a morale bonus of +2 with a maximum of 11. But again, unfortunately, these are not spelled out in the player aid, right? So here, no morale check. Yeah, well, unfortunately, there's no advanced rules play aids. And that's why I say this is kind of like a game kit. It normally checks when it takes losses or after melee with a bonus of 2. A unit in fortified farm or castle has a morale bonus of 3 with a maximum of 11. It normally checks when it takes losses after melee. Yeah. I'm iffy about those maximums. Like, why not let it be immune to morale checks if it's a really good morale unit? And I almost feel like that applies. Troops reintegration. A unit in good order out of fire range of an enemy unit with a leader on it that did not move during movement phase, that already took losses, can try to recover 1 loss during a rally phase. It must pass a morale check to recover a step. If more steps have to be recovered, it can follow the same procedure in following turns, but you can't recover units that have been fully lost. That's assuming the casualty rates are fairly low, I guess, but you can pick up units, men from other units, I guess. For a core-based demoralization, to avoid the players knowing exactly when it'll occur, when demoralization level of -5 is reached, the player rolls 2 dice and adds this value to the normal value -5. I don't know where this -5 is. This gives the new threshold. Oh, I'm sorry. If you're 5 less than your demoralization value, you roll 2 dice, add this to the normal value -5, and this will give you the actual demoralization level. So your demoralization levels are just approximates, but only on core-based. Okay. And finally, fatigue. And they say this is an experimental rule which may not work. Fatigue is a new parameter at the core level that makes a core engaged for too long be fragile. At the end of each turn, if you move more than half your movement allowance for any units in a corps, you get a fatigue point for that corps. Artillery and cavalry, as well as artillery from Cav Corps, are excluded from this rule. Artillery and cavalry attached to infantry corps. Add 1 to the level of a numerical marker set under the leader counter. A unit moved on a road less than half its movement allowance gets this +1 movement point bonus instead of the normal +2. Disorganized unit moves are not involved in this rule. They'll be allowed to retreat as far as they like without getting tired. A corps which a unit attacks in melee gets a fatigue point, in addition to fatigue points taken in movement. I assume that goes in both directions. A corps which a unit attacks. No, I think it's if you attack, you get a fatigue point. Defending doesn't give you one. Artillery and cavalry from infantry corps don't count. Artillery and cav corps do not count. Being the target of fire or melee does not count. Firing does not count. A corps which no unit moves at all and no unit is engaged in melee recovers a fatigue point. A corps which no unit moves and no unit has been fired upon gets 2 back. When 5 fatigue points are accumulated, the marker 5 under the leader is replaced by a marker 1 on top of the leader. This is a morale drop of all units in his corps. If the corps starts recovering, the marker 1 is replaced by marker 4, etc. So then you have a cost on a per corps basis in terms of morale. And one army leader can create a provisional corps with units from a single corps, which can be engaged without its parent corps suffering from fatigue. I don't know if the provisional corps then starts suffering fatigue. I would assume so. That doesn't sound like too painful a fatigue roll, actually. All right. Let me take a little break. And yes, I know this is going forever. I don't know why I want to get it on one video, but that's what we're doing. Okay, so here's where the options kind of go the craziest, which is with the command and control roles. First level is leaders. And these are somewhat cumulative, so you can kind of pick and choose in some cases. In some cases, they're cumulative. In some cases, they really aren't, even though it says they are. And we'll see why. Some of them withdraw certain aspects. When a leader is eliminated, you roll a die a second time, and then there's going to be a certain number of turns in which that leader cannot act, i.e. there's not going to be any leader for that unit that rises to give you any advantages. Not a big deal. Okay. Second line is command radius. The units have to stay within 6 hexes of their commander. Leaders have to be within 10 hexes of their superior commander. This has to be checked every turn. Then, obviously, independent units detached from their parent corps are not affected. Wow, you know, we don't have rules on independent units and detachments. What? Out-of-command units cannot voluntarily exit their hex unless they're trying to get back to their range. They don't really go into any detail on this, but, you know, you should be able to fudge it and understand well enough what it's meant. There are some things they can do. They can change facing. They can advance after combat. They can, if they're cav, they can charge into adjacent hexes. They can countercharge or they can withdraw. Doesn't say anything about fire, but it doesn't say they can't do it either. First turn, all units and their leaders are under command. Third level, tactical orders. Okay, now we start getting into something a little beyond sort of the standard minimal level. And these are all optional, right? You can play with no command and control at all. Okay. So at this level, you send secret orders to your subordinates. A leader no longer has to be within 10 hexes of his superior to move. i.e., yeah, we start withdrawing rules. The Army commander's movement allowance is half his normal movement allowance only. He gets back his whole movement allowance if the Army gets demoralized or if half his corps have a retreat order. In this case, he no longer really has to lead. Okay. So you send an aide-de-camp to carry command to units, and you roll a die to check to see that the general will obey the order. There'll be rules for that in a little bit. If the test is successful, the order is applied the next game turn. Each time a general receives an order, it cancels the previous one. The Army commander is stacked with his subordinate. It's an automatic transmission, and it's automatically obeyed. Okay. Tactical orders are attack, and these are kind of like the musket and pike orders, except they're delivered more like CWB orders. The leader must engage at least a third of his good units in combat. March. The units can move in column, and there's no real, well, what happens if you can't? I don't know. March doesn't give you orders where you have to march to. Defense, you can only move 2 hexes per turn, and only 1 hex towards your line of communication, and you cannot move closer to the enemy lines of communication. You must draw a line on your position, which is the forward limit of your defense area. Yeah, I don't know. Where do you draw that? You take a pen and mark it? What? Withdrawal. You must withdraw 2 to 3 hexes per turn. No more, no less. Retreat. You must move at least 3 hexes per turn towards your lines of communication. Reserve. This can be used at the start of the game only. Movement is allowed, but the units must stay at least 6 hexes or more from the nearest enemy unit. You can replace this order by a defend order at any time without a die roll and without any penalty. Once this decision is taken, new order is fully in effect. Okay. When a corps commander receives an order, his units are considered more apt to fight than other units having no combat fatigue. I think this is under the reserve order still. They have a +1 bonus to the die in each melee round. In each melee combat, they execute for 3 turns. Okay. Cavalry Corps is autonomous. It can switch from attack order to march at any time. If the chain of command includes a wing commander between the Army commander and the Corps commander, the order must be sent from the Army commander to the wing commander, and then from the wing commander to the Corps commander. At the start of the game, each leader has an initial order, which are freely allocated. Corps without a valid order adopt a defend order. No corps can be without any order at all. And then the Army commanders have a specified number of orders that they can give per turn. Remember, these are sent by an aide-de-camp, and they have to actually move the hexes out. Only an Army commander can send new orders. A wing commander can never send a new order. On the other side, he can decide to send all his corps an order that was sent for just one of his corps. All corps will receive the same order. The Army commander can send a retreat order, and you're really going to have to... So there's little markers to indicate orders, and they're kind of weird here. So, like, you have an attack order here, but it's yellow, and it's on the back of certain skirmishers, and it's kind of like you can't play with the skirmishers if you play with the order chits. But also, you have to specify which corps it's going to, and I'm not sure that the chits really do that. So I would suggest little scraps of paper for the orders if you're doing this one. General retreat order. The Army commander can send a retreat order to all corps, and he can't send any other orders this turn. Movement distances are in a straight line except for forbidden terrain. Out of command, and there are aide-de-camp markers to carry the orders with them. A disorganized unit obeys the rules 4.5, 4.10, or 4.13. I assume those are the normal disorganized rules rather than its orders. All right, the fourth level is written orders. So this system is, I guess, as far as it goes. I thought there were 5. Oh, yep. Yeah, there's a 5th level here. So written orders, each order can contain several elements, including a tactic, like the 3rd level, attack, march, whatever, and or an objective, time limits, a combination of these, a succession of tactics and objectives. A leader must execute his primary orders for at least 3 continuous turns. Then starting with the 4th turn, and you can have a secondary order which takes place if the primary order succeeds. Starting on the 4th turn, you're allowed to consider the endeavor failed and fall back to a secondary order. There's no penalty to change. Now, secondary order is normally if the primary order succeeds, but then there's another secondary order if the primary order fails. So I guess you can include both. If you wish. There's no penalty to change order in this case. I would also assume that you could try to cancel the order in order to just fall back to a default defend. So you don't have to write that in every order if there is no secondary order. If a leader wants to disregard the order he's received, he may check initiative, and he gets a morale penalty. If the primary order is fulfilled and the corps has no secondary order, the corps acts as if it's in defense. Yeah. Same happens if an order becomes irrelevant, and that's why I say the failure. If you don't put a secondary order, I think you should just be able to drop into defense. Written orders must be as clear as possible with neither too many nor too few details. Do not write orders like the following, and it gives some indications of how you should not do it. All very, very loose. This is much looser than what CWB and NBS do for their orders. On level 3 and 4, you have to move an aide-de-camp who has 12 movement allowances. He has to stay away from the nearest enemy unit unless the leader's within 5 hexes, in which case he can be next to an enemy unit. He can't get through them. Some allied armies have rigid chains of commands with wing leaders commanding several corps. In this case, the aide must first reach the proper wing commander, and then it continues to the corps commander. And remember, the wing commander can interfere with that order and extend it to all his corps. He can't change the order in any way, though. He doesn't implement the order as a wing and then break it into corps the way, say, CWB does. Intercepting an order with corps and division. If an enemy unit moves within 2 hexes from a friendly aid, the enemy player immediately moves this aid beyond this distance to an adjacent hex. Then the enemy unit can continue its movement. This can happen more than once per aid, and you can kind of shove the aid away from the area. You can't actually take the order away, though, and destroy it. Okay. There's an obedience value on the back of each leader. It's also the initiative value or something like that. This generally ranges from 3 to 5. France has a 4, coalition has a 3 on default if it's not present. Oh no, this is the average. When a leader gets a new order, he must do an obedience check. The order is accepted if the die roll is less than or equal to the leader's obedience. On a success, the previous order is still in effect for this turn, and then the new order goes into effect next turn. If it's a failure, the previous order is going to be in effect for the next 2 turns. And then a delay check is made. The delay check puts the order into effect in the next turn after the delay check is made, 2 turns later, or, hey, it just didn't happen. for whatever reason. The army commander and the leader to which the order is sent are in the same hex, though, is automatically accepted, they explain it. Now we come to initiative. All orders are delivered and the obedience checks are performed. A corps commander can try to figure out how he wants to do things all on his own. He does an initiative check. If the leader does so, all his units will have a morale penalty, and he'll have some problems if he fails. Whenever the results of the check, the effects will take place on the next turn. On the leader counter and on the card, and on his card, I don't know where there's a card, maybe here. I don't see it here, and there are no cards in the game. Maybe some of the scenarios have one. Special rules for each battle may give different values. This has an initiative value, which may be different from the obedience value. In some places it says the initiative is on the back. Oh, we got two values here. Let's see which is which. It feels like the rules aren't necessarily linked to this rulebook. Okay, so initiative's on the top, obedience is on the bottom. All right. And I'll probably be going with this fourth level here, with written orders and all this stuff. When a leader decides to modify his tactic, he rolls a die, and the new order is applied if the die roll is lower than or equal to the initiative state value. In level 2, you can use the initiative for leaders who are out of range of their commander, but we don't have that anymore because we've got written orders. Okay, and if you succeed, the previous tactic stays in effect, and the new tactic goes into play next turn. All units will get a -1 morale for the next turn as they start this new effect. On a failure, the previous tactic is in effect, and all leaders in that command will have a -2 during the next turn. The negatives are the leader's hesitation and confusion. Wing leader cannot use initiative to alter his subordinates. Order check. An order is never revealed to the enemy except if the enemy feels he's being cheated. Hey, I'm being cheated. I'm still being cheated. I'm being cheated. Yeah, no, that's not going to really work. Anyway, in general, it's up to the players to figure out how they're handling this. And they're really, like with the CWB NBS stuff, you really have to, just trust your opponent. And every now and then you can say something like, if those are attack orders to take this location, I think you're going over the bounds. That's something I did over on NBS. No, on CWB. Yeah, same game, basically. All right. Pen, paper, and that's all. What? You don't play with the board? This is the most historical. It's based on free written orders. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is intended for team play. You play with the first 2 levels of command and control. Orders are transmitted the same as in levels 3 and 4. The number of orders is limited, but you don't check obedience or initiative. Basically, the player tries to interpret the orders. This does not work if the same person's writing the orders who's reading them. It's got to be different people. And I've played games like this, and it's awesome, but I wouldn't suggest it otherwise. And he gives examples of some reasonable orders here. Okay. Strategic deployment. This gives an alternate battle setup. A battle did not start with both sides agreeing on their respective setup. The deployment often had some initial battles. This will allow you to simulate various skirmishes preceding the real battle. So what this is going to do is you divide the map into 16 identical squares. Well, luckily the map was already divided into those for each sheet. Now, this might not work in bigger battles. Each player takes in hand his commander counters belonging to the infantry corps that were present. He leaves the army commander and the cavalry commander. The first player places an infantry corps leader face down on the map in one of the 4 squares adjacent to his edge. The other player does the same, alternating. Wow, this sounds like that mini design that I looked at, which may have come out around the same time, so I don't know which preceded. The procedure lasts as long as the player has the leader to be placed who is present on the battlefield at the game setup. Stacking limit is 2 infantry corps per segment of the map. Then the cav deploy and move with an infantry corps, and then you specifically deploy the units. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I don't see playing with this in my solo game. Limits for an amount of time to play each turn with a penalty assessed, which is morale penalties on the corps. Desperate armies are given even less time to think. And then, like I said, it's totally a game kit. Oh, you don't like I go, you go games? Okay, well, instead let's alternate. And one player activates a corps, then the other player activates a corps. If you have less corps than the other player, you can pass. And this changes the sequence of play a little bit. Basically, you have a full sequence of play for each corps that's activated. Yeah, it gets you a little bit more detail and a little bit more interest. But, why not add rules for, hey, if you like chip pull, make little chits for each of the corps and throw them in a cup. Whatever. I think it's cool. It's the kind of stuff I consider doing with any game. So, for example, I think about adding an order system to the old Terrible Swift Sword, because I really liked Gettysburg at that level, and honestly, there were some battles that the TSS system covered, things like Wilson's Creek, etc. CWB and Regimental series don't cover, and I didn't have anything with those rules. And likewise, hey, I could take Labatt and I could modify that, and then I have, most of the Napoleonic battles. Well, this system more or less takes that kind of, here are some ideas you might want to add to your game. And I find that kind of interesting. I would be a lot more positive on this if the map artwork was prettier than it is. I really actually find this map artwork very, very unpleasant. And the hexes are big, and there's this blandness to it. And like I said, I do not like the Barber style. Let me see if he's indeed, because it really looks like his style. I'm just so used to him. No, it's Charlie Kibler. It really, it looks like a sparser version of the Barber style. And I'm used to, so I like his maps when Clash of Arms does the single color, the mainly white map with his artwork on it. I find that kind of pleasing in a sort of way. This reminds me of some of the stuff that came out. Say TSR did some of these that looked like this when they took over SPI. And, the color choices along here, the overall look of it looks sort of like a Greyhawk map, or, in terms of the amount of detail in the village or whatever. And then the overall map with this reminds me of something, that was really done, I don't know, by a child, basically. It doesn't have that beautiful, I like my maps to be very white, to be honest, but I can live with or I can actually enjoy the colors that like later TSS games had with their elevation levels and all that. They had a certain level of detail. The forests looked forestier, and then I've learned to cope with the CWB games, which have really hideous maps compared to this, probably by most people's estimation. But you know, they look like the layer cake. They make sense to me, and they give me the information in just a fashion that I find more visually pleasant, even if some people think it's terribly garish. This looks to me like a 6-year-old drew it with crayons. That's an argument that I have with Barber's colored maps, and I'm kind of surprised Charlie Kibler, because he's done some really beautiful maps. But then again, so has Barber. It's just when he starts using colors, not as fond, like terrain levels and such. All right, let's send this up, and I don't know when I'll get started. Maybe tonight, maybe not.